It's really my pleasure to finally be able to host a longtime scholar and expert on Russian foreign policy, and actually Russian domestic politics as well, here at Georgia Tech. And Professor Charles Ziegler from the University of Louisville is really well-known and established scholar, not just of Russian foreign policy in general, but specifically on East Asia and Russian-China relations, energy relations. He's also done a lot of work on civil society and democracy and democratization. So he really brings both a comparativist and international relations perspective to Russia and China relations, which is the topic of the talk today. And Professor Ziegler he's published many books and is a really established scholar in his own right. He's held many positions, distinguished positions at the University of Louisville, but he also, I think, is in the enviable position of being the director of a fellowship program, the Grawemeyer Fellowship Program, where he gets to call people
once a year
and tells them that they just won $100,000. So that's the job I want to have. And so that you can see why everybody in the field likes it. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Chuck to talk to us today about Russian-Chinese relations.
Okay, thank you. So I think the mic is on now. Can you hear okay? I don't want to be shouting too much. At this point in the day, my voice is starting to go a little bit. I wanted to thank Dr. Stolberg for inviting me down here. They've been working me pretty well, but having a good time. Also, I want to thank Chris for the logistics on this, and just thank the Sam Nunn School for hosting me here. It's great to come down. Georgia Tech has such a stellar reputation in the field of education. So, share a few things with you about Russia-Chinese relations. This paper was not one I had planned on doing, but I was approached by the National Bureau for Asian Research a while back and said, well, we're doing this big project, and would you be interested in doing the chapter on trade, energy, finance, and so on? And I said, well, okay, yeah. And it turned out really to be pretty interesting. If you want, you can go to the nbr.org. It's their website. They're out of Seattle, and they do a lot of very good stuff. But the book has my chapter on energy. It's got other chapters on security and so on. It was a good project to do. So I'm going to focus on some issues a little more broadly than what I did just in this chapter. So like security, I touch on there, but I'm trying to give you more of that so you get a broader perspective on some of the things that are going on. So in the Russia-China relationship overall, very important now. And the whole thing, NBR aims for the policy people, the folks in Washington. We did a briefing at the Assistant Secretary of Defense office for East Asia. They still call it, they haven't renamed it Indo-Asia or Indo-Pacific yet. And we did a book launch there. So a lot of they really targeted at the folks in Washington. So the whole thing that they're worried about now is, well, what does this partnership mean for the United States? How do we react to it? Is it a real partnership? Is it something ephemeral? Or what? So that's kind of the context for this. If you look at the past, and these date lines on here are somewhat arbitrary, but they're pretty accurate. Early period, from the signing of the treaty between the Soviet Union and China in 1950, where they were supposedly fraternal communist allies. The thing was that the Soviets were very arrogant about the relationship. They would teach the Chinese how to be good communists, and Mao in particular resisted that. Tensions develop in the late 50s and into the early 60s, and then they become competitors for the position of, let's say, the most important communist country in the world. And the Chinese, of course, criticize the Soviets for being revisionists, for leaving Stalin's legacy and so on. And it peaks then with military clashes in 1969, really the low point. Of course, at that point, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger take advantage of that dynamic in order to play the two powers off against each other, right? At the point where we were roughly co-equal with the Soviets and the Chinese were considerably weaker. My point later, what you need to think about is that that particular constellation of powers is long gone. So now what you have is a US which has been dominant since the end of the Cold War, but declining in relative power terms. China rising, and there's, of course, Graham Allison's argument about the Thucydides trap. Does that mean we're going to be involved in war? Whether or not that's the case, we'll have to wait and see. But the point is that Russia now is the weak power. In a way, it's flipped with China. And so after this period when communism was collapsing up until about 2000, when Mr. Putin becomes president, Russia is very weak and only, in the past 2 decades really has come back and is now trying to forge this strategic partnership with China. How long that will last is an open question, but the consensus of the study that we did was that it's probably going to last for a while yet. It is not something ephemeral. So what underlies this partnership? Certainly opposition to US unilateralism. The sort of triumphalist ideas that we had at the end of the Cold War, Fukuyama's end of history, liberal democracies, the wave of the future, the US can pretty well do what it wants to with its hyperpower. Opposition to that. The two countries also share a number of norms, if you will, ways of looking at the world. Certainly absolute sovereignty, non-interference in internal affairs, the importance of political stability, an authoritarian political system as opposed to liberal democracy, resistance to democracy promotion, which I think with this administration is pretty much on the outs anyway. So they do share a common perspective, if you will. But again, what we found in the study was that both Russia and China have weaknesses. And certainly China has a number of problems, whether it's debt that they face, pollution problems, a grain population. There are quite a few. But they pale by comparison, I think, with Russia's. And so Russia, I would see as coming back, but yet severely constrained. China as definitely rising, but with constraints of its own. Like the Clinton administration, the Clinton Secretary of State, the Obama administration, Russia had a pivot to Asia also. And there's, as with the American pivot, began really, I think, before 2011. It was discussed a lot early in Putin's years as president, but it was the Ukraine crisis that really sparked this discussion of turning eastward. Not completely abandoning Europe. As we'll see, Russia can't really do that. There's too many reasons for them to stay together. But I've had even European, Russians who are European in their orientation have told me that, well, we don't feel like we're really accepted as part of Europe anymore. It doesn't mean that they're going to be really Asian, but this whole notion of Eurasianism, I think, has taken on a new tone in the wake of the Ukraine crisis. That ties into this resentment of America's position, the advance of NATO eastward, adding new members from 1977 onward has been a big part of it. And from that perspective, Europe looks, if not hostile, at least not very welcoming, whereas Asians, and I say Asians deliberately, not just Chinese, but even South Koreans, Japanese, Indonesians, Indians, are less critical of Russia than, for the most part, I think, than are Europeans. And add into that the fact of concentration of population, the concentration of economic power, and Russians, like, again, like in the Obama administration, the notion is a pivot toward the Pacific, toward Asia makes sense because that's where it's at for the future. So what are Russia's interests? I'm basically a realist, and so I always think in terms of national interests. What are they? If we look at the different dimensions of Asia, in East Asia, China is far and away the most important for Russia. It's not the only one, but even to the point where a number of Russian analysts say we shouldn't be putting so many of our eggs in the Chinese basket, really. We should broaden out. But there are problems. Japan and South Korea, of course, are allies, formal allies of the United States. Japan, you have the island dispute. South Korea, you have the North-South divide. So that makes it a little more complicated. In Central Asia, and we'll tie China back into this later, certainly China and Russia come together in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, economically and politically, to a certain extent in security terms, but not that significant. But Russia also has interest in the Russian compatriots, mostly ethnic Russians, but also others who speak Russian, who identify with Russia in Central Asia. Fewer of those than in the past, but they're still there. And the potential for terrorism, Central Asians who have gone off to fight with ISIS in Syria and elsewhere. But that's a very important area. And then South and Southeast Asia, there the most important issues are trade and weapons sales. So, visual, if you don't have a map, a mental map in your head. As you can see, Russia is really a Pacific power, an Asian power, except, of course, most of the population is concentrated in European Russia. So, as I said, China, key partner in Asia for Moscow. What they call it now, and it's sort of, some people have noticed that they keep adding descriptors here, and now it's called a comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination. All right? Strategic partnership, that's probably good enough. But the point is that they really like to emphasize how strong the relationship is, that it's better than it has been at any time in the past. And as we saw, they have common interests. What they don't have, and this seemed to be the consensus with the NBR study too, and that is that we don't really expect to see a formal alliance developing between the two, in the sense that, say, if one party is attacked, the other would come to their aid. And both have said, no, we don't want that. They want to maintain a certain flexibility. So we don't really expect that to happen. All of that is a worry in Washington. The last bullet point is about Russia's hedging strategy, meaning they're covering they're hedging their bets. So China's important, but Russia is also attempting a policy that will improve relations with Japan, trying to set the island issue aside. Hard to do, but Prime Minister Abe has been willing to work with Russia on that. South Korea, India, long-term partner. They don't want to lose that relationship, especially now that the US is talking about the Indo-Pacific, and we've been moving closer to India. They're trying to hold on to that, with arms agreements and diplomacy. Pakistan, which is something new for Russia, traditionally an ally both of the US and China. And then ASEAN. Again, as I said, the further you get out, the interests are mostly in minor trade. The trade with ASEAN is really pretty small, and some arms sales, right? But again, hedging, because the notion that China is not and should not be everything. But here you see they are, on the surface at least, best friends. So you see the mutual awards they've given to each other, always willing to say nice things about each other. So certainly on the surface, it's all warm and rosy. In resisting the U.S., this is something they can certainly agree on between the two of them. So China, I think, is not very happy with the annexation of Crimea. What they were doing in southeast Ukraine, not such a big deal, but the idea of violating sovereignty by taking over Crimea, a little disturbing, and the Chinese understood it from a historical point of view, and that's kind of what they were doing with their 9-dash line out in the South China Sea. So reciprocity says that Russia then doesn't criticize China over what it's doing in the South China Sea. It's sort of a mutual tolerance. That's your sphere, this is my sphere. This is where we see agreement on things like the THAAD system that's going in South Korea, the anti-ballistic missile complex in Romania and Poland. So the one is obviously Russia's key interest affected, the other is more China's, but they agree, and they don't know if they really coordinate on it, but they criticize these. And we're seeing more and more, especially since about 2011, we've seen increasing joint military exercises in places such as the Baltic Sea, I mean sensitive places like that, which sends a signal to the Baltic states, to Poland, worries them. South China Sea in 2016, again, having exercises there near these disputed territories, it also sends a signal. And then the most recent, of course, just a few weeks back, 6-8 weeks back, the Vostok exercises in the Russian Far East. Chinese had a small contingent there, and it's hard to know how to interpret this. The Chinese have a chance to see what the Russians can do. The Russians maybe want to make an impression on the Chinese that they're determined to hold on to their sparsely populated Far East. Together they can send a signal to the US and keep them on their toes. And there are a lot of different dimensions to this. So there you see 3 of those. The one in the lower right-hand corner is actually a few months earlier. Putin reviewing the troops in China. So, trade issues, what I looked at in this chapter. And the one thing that really strikes me is how imbalanced the economic relationship is between Russia and China. So if you're looking at that as an indicator of how greatly they're cooperating, you're not going to find a whole lot. That's my bottom line, and I'll explain to you why. On the surface, again, it looks pretty good. We see a pretty dramatic increase in trade from 2000, when Mr. Putin becomes president, to last year, 87 billion. They're talking about maybe 100 billion this year. But something you have to keep in mind is a lot of this involves Russian oil sales to China, and that depends on what happens to the international price of oil. So if it goes up, yeah, trade looks better. If it drops off, trade doesn't look that good. Look at the second bullet point there, where in 01, Russia accounted for just over 2% of China's total trade, while China accounted for about 5% of Russia's. You go 15 years later, still Russia accounted for less just a little less than 2% of China's overall trade. It was China's number 14 partner, whereas China had become Russia's most important trading partner, accounting for almost a sixth of Russia's trade. So just in that period of time, the balance has really shifted. At the same time, in 2016, the European Union took almost half of Russia's exports, while China took under 10%. So again, even if they're talking about a shift toward Asia, more trade and so on with China, the reality is it's going to take quite a bit longer than that. It will be a gradual shift. This is also very interesting, I think, if you look at the structure. Look at 01, machinery and equipment, 28.7% of Russia's exports to China. By the time you get to 2011, machinery and equipment, 0.7%. All right? And then imports from China, 9.3% in 01, 39% in 2016. Look at the share of mineral exports to China, just over 10% in 01, 3/4 of exports in 2011. So what this means is Russia, in a way, has become what a number of Russian specialists worry about all the time, becoming a raw materials appendage to China, almost a colonial relationship. And China, of course, is modernized very rapidly, and so we see the machinery and equipment includes, again, you've got computers, cell phones, a lot of high-tech stuff, maybe automobile parts and so on. Russia just, again, can't compete in those areas. So it's becoming a very lopsided or imbalanced type of trade relationship. The Belt and Road Initiative. This is Xi Jinping's big plan to develop infrastructure, to export China's goods, to create new corridors, import routes too. They talk about the Silk Road and this and that. How much they're going to invest and how productive that will be, it's tough to say. If the best study of it so far is Nadège Roland's book. Also, it came out through NBR on the Belt and Road Initiative. Her book is very good on that. So how does this impact Russia? Obviously, Putin's big deal is this Eurasian Economic Union. You probably know, you may know, that this was what really drove a wedge between Russia and Ukraine. Because Putin was pushing Ukraine to join the Eurasian Economic Union. That's what sparked off the demonstrations from especially younger people in Ukraine who didn't want their country oriented more toward Russia, wanted to go with the European Union. It's really important for Mr. Putin. But now, here China comes up with the Belt and Road Initiative, and all the indications are this is simply going to take the ground out from under Mr. Putin's plans for this Eurasian Economic Union. Because Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Belarus, these are all countries which are part of it, and yet they are also part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So Belarus is a long way from China, but already outside of Minsk, they're building this big industrial park that is going to be part of the terminus, I think, of the Belt and Road Initiative. So Russia can't really compete economically. Politically, it's very important. Again, Putin, I think, maintains a very positive face on this. They discussed as early as 2015 and agreed that they were going to combine their efforts between the Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative. Just this past May, signed a formal free trade agreement. But I really can't see that Russia is going to be an equal in this relationship. Which suggests that, especially in Central Asia and even into Eastern Europe, Over time, I think we're going to see China likely erode Russia's influence. There's a visual on the routes here. And again, most of this, if you look at it, for the most part, it bypasses Russia. It goes to the south. Now, the Russian Far East, the areas which are out are part of Asia. Russians claim to be an Asia-Pacific country. There's not much population out there. It's still, Russia's a huge country. I think you know that. It's twice the size of the United States. Russians always think, when they think Siberia and the Far East, they think natural resources, right? Gold, timber, silver, oil, gas, whatever, uranium, whatever it is. And they can't get it out of their heads that that's not the only thing that makes you wealthy. But they're also convinced that Westerners want to steal that wealth. I think a lot of people in that region also feel that China wants to steal their wealth. And they've always had this frontier mentality about the Russian Far East, that it's an area which it needs to be defended because it's very vulnerable. So this development program that they've been pushing in the past few years is designed to try to lure more population out there. They lost a lot of population after the collapse of the Soviet Union because there just weren't jobs out there. It's tough, you know, it's like trying to make it in Alaska or northern Canada for the most part. So a lot of people just left. So hopefully Asian countries, China, South Korea, Japan, will be investing in the Russian Far East and help build it up. And that's Moscow's plan, at least. Whether or not that'll work out, hard to say. This is the Far East, a big area. The Russians always divide their country into European Russia, West Siberia, East Siberia, and then the Far East. That's how their geographers do it. The Russian Far East alone is the size of the US from the Mississippi to the Atlantic. And it's got 6.2 million people in it. So it gives you an idea of how sparsely populated it is. There you see population density concentrated very much in Europe, European Russia, very little out in especially eastern Siberia and the Far East. So, as I said, a lot of resources there, and also the Pacific itself. Very important security terms, controlling the Sea of Okhotsk. We're seeing renovation, modernization of the Russian submarine force, nuclear force. Fishing is important out there. Trade, again, ports, Vladivostok, and so on. So, and this also ties into the Arctic, where again, Russia's making a big push to be a major player in the Arctic. They have more Arctic territory than anyone else in the world. With global warming, climate change, they're looking for the Northern Passage to be open for larger parts of the year, and they've got the big icebreaker force, and you can ship goods. Hopefully they're going to ship, China will ship goods through, and Russia will get good transit fees out of that. Liquefied natural gas from the Yamal project, and so on. So these are all things that they're looking forward to, and this is where you hear up about the beefing up of military forces in the Arctic territories. So talk a bit more about energy. Of course, the estimates are that something like 2/3 of additional demand through about 2040 for hydrocarbons is going to be concentrated in the Asia Pacific. It'll be China, India, other countries in the region. Right now, And some of this you may have had if you have Dr. Stolberg for class. I imagine he's covered most of this. But there's one major pipeline, the ESPO, that goes out to the Pacific and with a spur down to China. Big projects, especially Sakhalin 2, it's an international project, Shell's in on, plus India companies and so on. And then the Power of Siberia natural gas project. That was one, again, they made a lot of that 2 months after Russia annexed Crimea. Putin apparently stepped in. They secured a deal with the Chinese that they've been working on for about a decade with differences over pricing in order to send natural gas to China. So now they're talking about mid-December, I think, of 2019 to get that pipeline finished. So in terms of interests, China appreciates the oil. The Malacca Strait is a choke point where the U.S. could interdict shipping in the event of a conflict. And so, yeah, it's nice to have the oil come in by pipeline. But of course, there's also oil coming in from Kazakhstan, lots of other places that China can get it. Japan and South Korea, liquefied natural gas coming out of Sakhalin is important. India, possibility of a gas pipeline, although I don't think that's anytime in the near future. And then, of course, Russia would, has not plans, at least hopes, if the Korean Peninsula issue settles down, to run a pipeline through there along with the railway down to North Korea. Mr. Putin out inspecting how things are going along the Pacific Ocean pipeline. There you see the route for the SPO. And you see the spur down to Daqing in China. And then out to Cosmino where they can export it. Again, think of what that means. It means that while, and there was a lot of dispute over this earlier, between Russia, China, and Japan. Japan wanted it run out to the coast so they could get the oil. China wanted it sent to Daqing for the refineries there, and they ended up splitting the difference, if you will, or compromising. Russia didn't want to send all the oil to China and then be, if you will, constrained by what China wanted to pay for it. It's much better to send it out, and then from that port of Cosmino, you can send it wherever you want to any market. You're not linked into a deal with China. And there's Power of Siberia, the gas pipeline, how it's going to run. As you can see, it ties into the pipeline that runs the length of Sakhalin and already goes down to Vladivostok this time. And finally, a little closer to the Sakhalin pipeline. Okay, some things that don't come out, I think, very often when people talk about the energy relationship between Russia and China, which, and you see a lot of stuff in the popular press about how this is developing and so on. If you look, I don't have the figures up here, but if you want to go look at them, you see that the West Siberian reserves, the fields that are around Tyumen and through there, much larger. Even though a number of them have been depleted, they're still a lot bigger than those in East Siberia. So the ones in East Siberia, obviously, they're the ones that are going to be piped eastward. West Siberia, that's what goes to Europe, okay? And plus just going through the tundra, going through permafrost and so on, it's expensive. China is, as I alluded to before, not willing to depend that heavily on Russia, already getting gas and oil from Central Asia, developing new ties to the Middle East, Sudan and Africa, other places. talk to Venezuelans. So, you know, neither side, Russia does not want to become dependent on exports to China. China does not want to have overly dependent on imports from Russia. And again, the bottom point I think it's worth making, point worth making. 70% almost of Russia's oil exports go to Europe. 90% of its gas exports still do. So it still means that Europe is very important in Russia's calculus. In Central Asia, we talked about that some before. This is a big question. Are there more elements for cooperation or competition between the two in Central Asia? Russia certainly, I think this falls under what Medvedev called the privileged sphere of interests among the former republics. There's still ethnic Russians, quite a few living there, and a number of Central Asians working in Russia. US influence, there's still a suspicion of it, but we're out of Kyrgyzstan, the Manas base, we were out of Uzbekistan years ago. And I don't really see this administration doing that much in Central Asia. So I think the US is kind of factored out of it. So then the question is, well, what about either cooperation or competition with China in Central Asia? So you've got the energy deals with Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, investments, Chinese there. I think we've had, let's see, was anyone been to Central Asia, kind of around there? See any Chinese towns, if you will, areas where Chinese are, discussions of it? Most of the big cities have this. And certainly the Central Asians are worried about that. They, like Kazakhstan, they'll always say, hey, you know, we're just a statistical anomaly in Chinese census numbers. You know, we're so small. They feel they can easily be overwhelmed by large numbers of Chinese. And certainly they're overwhelmed, I think, by China's economic power. And you see, and this has happened certainly in just a couple of decades, or a little more after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now China's trade with the region is nearly double what Russia's trade is with it. So again, that's an area where Russia can't compete. And I would suggest over the long term, even though Mr. Putin doesn't want to discuss it, I think that is a factor for tensions between the two. So there's oil and gas pipelines, oil in green, and the Turkmenistan pipeline in red. And Kazakhstan is discussing a gas pipeline too, out to the PRC. What about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? There's been a lot of discussion over the years about it. Is it a big worry? Is it a counterpart to NATO? Is it just an empty shell? I think in a way, it may be becoming more of an empty shell. It was enough of one before. But now you see India and Pakistan being both admitted in 2017. Again, my read on that is, of course, that China, Russia wants India in on it. China then would want Pakistan, given the hostilities at work there. And while they talk a lot about how maybe membership in the organization is going to dampen down tensions between India and Pakistan, I don't buy it. And what it may do is simply make the organization less effective than it already is. In the past, China wanted it to be more of a forum for trade, investment, and so on. Russia pushed back on that. And so, in a way, you might see the Belt and Road Initiative as China simply saying, fine, we'll do our own project if you don't want to work with us on trade through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Growing potential, I probably should have put a question mark there. Because I'm still not quite convinced about that. So, like most academics, I've talked too much. I've got a couple of summary slides here, wrap it up, and then get to the Q&A. So, the partnership, very important for both countries. I think a major one has to be balancing the U.S. in realist terms. They can, through the UN Security Council, veto what the U.S. might want to do, regime change, Syria, places like that. We talked about the ballistic missile defense and mutual interests there. Economic reasons are important, but my point here was that it's a very imbalanced sort of relationship. If you look at the general East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia region, I think economics is a big part of what Moscow is trying to do, building up its Russian Far East, attracting investment and so on. But there, another good example, I didn't talk much about it, and we don't have very good data, but the Chinese seem very reluctant to invest in the Russian Far East or really anywhere in Russia. And they're putting much more money into Britain or Switzerland, pharmaceutical companies and so on, than they are into Russia. In fact, there's a lot more investment going into Central Asia, Chinese investment, than there is going into Russia. So that means, and I think Russians understand that, and that's where we see the hedging behavior. Try to work with Japan, set the territorial dispute aside, develop ties with South Korea. South Koreans are present in a large number of areas of Russia. And then build up relations with formerly close countries like India and North Korea. Offer to be a go-between between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Develop ties with Pakistan and ASEAN. The implications for the U.S., what are those? I think our options are limited. And the way I started out was by saying this is a lot different than it was in '72 when Nixon went to Beijing. China is much more powerful now, at least economically, than Russia is, and certainly is becoming more powerful in terms of, say, its conventional warfare capabilities, its what military calls A2AD, anti-access area denial capability, which constrains what the U.S. can do in the Western Pacific. We talked about the Russia-China economic relationship. Remember, $87 billion in trade in 2017. You know what the figure was for U.S.-China trade? That's $735 billion. So, the U.S. is far more important economically for China than is Russia. All right? And again, what they get from Russia is largely raw materials, oil, gas, a few other things. In their broader vision of the global order, all the stuff you hear about, the decline of the liberal international order, certainly China's benefited more by that than has Russia, but I think they're in agreement that it needs to be reshaped. China wants to reshape it in their image. Russia would be more than happy to work with them on that, sort of ride on their coattails. And in this sense, I think Mr. Putin is helping them by destroying the liberal international order from within by the very country that set it up, namely our own. And at the same time, he's pursuing a trade strategy, not saying that we don't need to push China harder to deal with things like intellectual property rights and ease of investment and so on in their country. A lot that needs to be done there. But I think, and this is the bottom line, I don't think we've been very productive about it. And the little sub-point there at the bottom is probably the most important. And that is U.S. policy has needlessly alienated allies that we need if we're going to deal with this new constellation of global power. So I'll leave it there and be happy to take your questions.
Thank you.
So, yes?
Thanks for the great talk. I have a question. Do you see any possibility in the future that Russia might accept using Chinese currency to settle their energy trade because relying on U.S. dollars make Russia vulnerable to U.S. pressure, and China really love to push other countries to use this currency. So do you see an alignment of interest here, or?
Yes, I do. And there is some of that going on already. A few deals here and there. They're going to settle exchanges in yuan instead of dollars. Again, though I'm not that good an economist, but my understanding is you can only go so far with that. And the larger global economic system is still driven by dollars. The oil market is still in dollars. So while they can do some deals here and there in yuan, not rubles so much, but I think there's some scope for that, and they've talked about it. And that is, again, it's in line with the general discourse about we're tired of US dominance, and diminishing the role of the dollar is one way we can go about it. But again, I think there's just limited scope for that. But that's really something to watch. And every now and then you'll see, and they make a big deal about it when it happens. Oh, this is going to be handled in yuan rather than dollars. Yes?
From a national security perspective, what would the U.S. see as the biggest threat of this partnership?
I think probably in terms of the biggest security threat is one I just sort of tossed out and zoomed past. That was that anti-access area denial capabilities. In the Western Pacific, China's military buildup, and it's not that they're coordinating on this, so don't get me wrong about this, but that each, again, has sort of divided up an area of the world. For China, building up their anti-submarine or the anti-ship capabilities. Our aircraft carriers cannot operate the same way they could 20, 25 years ago in the Western Pacific, okay? I mean, the Chinese attack subs, the ballistic missile systems that they have along the coast, all that constrains the US ability there. Same time, and then when you think of the naval exercises they've done, again, South China Sea, Baltic Sea. In the Baltics, Russia's trying to do the same thing. So centered around Kaliningrad, that little enclave of Russian territory. They also have, anti-air capabilities, SAM 400, S-400 systems, anti-ship capabilities, and then Iskander missiles, ground-to-ground ballistic missiles. So again, to deny the U.S. The ability to operate effectively in military terms. I think that's the thing that worries the folks in the Pentagon most, in terms of security. Economics, less so. And the energy relationship, I don't see that as much of a threat. As I said, each is looking to diversify either their imports or exports. And if there's more oil on the market, it doesn't affect us that much, I don't see. You might disagree, and Dr. Stolberg's an expert on energy, but I don't really see anything that significant out of it.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that you pointed out on the map is that there's always this discussion about Russia playing Asia off of Europe, but you pointed out they're not of equal weight and the potential is different. But the pipelines don't afford that either. The Chinese were very careful to make sure that they weren't going to be put in that situation. So
Yeah, they're very smart. They don't want to become overly dependent on Russian energy. Yes?
So every couple of years there's those articles saying that in the future China will colonize Siberia and the Russian Far East. So not necessarily taking that as inevitable. There is like a serious demographic decline and depopulation of these zones. So in like a post-2050 era, do you think that Russia will at the very least be able to extract the kind of natural resources and energy from the Russian Far East or even Central Siberia with a declining ethnic Russian population in those areas and oblasts and republics?
Well, that's a big worry of a lot of Russian nationalists. In fact, there's some, I mean, it's like something you get out of the alt-right here. This video I saw about how all the Chinese are going to be taking over all of Siberia and the Far East, and it's this terrible yellow peril threat, this and that. But seriously, now, I'd be interested in seeing what other people have to say. Rich Ellings, who's president of NBR and a China specialist, during our discussions on that book, said he thinks that the unequal treaties, 1958, Aigun in Beijing, 58 or 1858 and 1860, are still remembered in China. And that was basically that whole Primorsky Krai, huge area that Russia got from China back then. Yes, the Russians and Chinese again say all those territorial issues have been solved. They're done. But the fact that there is such a population imbalance, there are 110 million Chinese in the 3 provinces bordering on the Russian Far East, and like it's 6.2 million Russians. Already, there are Chinese that are getting long-term leases for farms. You have restaurants out there. They're doing some business, all right? So over time, who knows? On the other hand, there's always on the other hand, right? On the other hand, if you're a hardworking citizen of China and you're living in Manchuria, and you say, do I want to go to Shanghai and get a job there, or do I want to go to Magadan? I don't think that would be much of a choice for me. I've been to both, and Shanghai is much nicer than Magadan. So are the opportunities up there all that great? Probably not. So you would have some, again, farmers who maybe have been tossed off their land in China or condo complexes or whatever. But in terms of a massive migration of tens of thousands or tens of millions of Chinese flooding into Siberian, Russian Far East, that I don't quite see.
And so you talked a little bit about the confrontation between the U.S. and China. What is driving that confrontation, and what can be done by us to kind of ease the tensions?
Well, it would be good if we would work within the international framework that we helped create at the end of World War II. All right? Yes, China is doing a lot of things economically it shouldn't. Work that out within the World Trade Organization, I would say. Don't just, like Trump does, threaten to withdraw from it, like pulling out of the TPP. I mean, I think that was a really unwise move. That would have leveraged some real influence, I think, over China to go with that agreement. But it was something that Obama had come up with. Trump somehow was convinced. I don't know, we talked about on it, talked to, but worst deal ever. Well, NAFTA was the worst deal ever. And the JCPOA was the worst deal ever. So we had a lot of worst deals ever. But certainly working within organizations like the WTO. And China has been willing to do that for the most part, in the UN and so on. But I see our policy as not being very effective in dealing with that. Maybe we didn't push hard enough in the past. I think you could make that argument on things like intellectual property rights. And maybe this is just his super smart bargaining strategy, but I don't really see it.
So Russia and China's relationship it sounds like it's clearly vital to their own interests. Are there any splinters in this relationship that, if left unaddressed, might turn this relationship a little bit colder in the future, or is there enough interdependence amongst the two of them where they just don't see that happening?
Well, my point was that there are certainly some weaknesses in the economic relationship, definitely. But the big thing is, I guess that's faded out by now, the previous slide about their trying to balance the U.S. Okay? That I don't see as changing. Years back, Artyom Lukin, for example, I don't know if you know Artyom, out at Vladivostok, Far Eastern Federal University, he said, well, the US and Russia would be natural balancers against a rising China, which I think is true, but it's not going to happen. I don't really see it. Because you've got two authoritarian countries, China and Russia. They do tend to see the world in the same way, and that is that they don't trust, certainly they don't trust the US. They don't trust these democratic movements, the sort of chaotic protest movements and so on. They believe that we stirred things up. Look at what we did in Libya. That was a big eye-opener. They went along, they didn't veto the UN Security Council resolution for a no-fly zone. And then look what happened. The US and its allies affected regime change. Gaddafi got slaughtered. And, my God, you can't trust these Americans. That's the sort of thing they're trying to do. I think that's an overriding commonality of interest that we sure don't want that to happen. And look at the Americans. They're pushing the rights for these fascists in Ukraine. They're pushing rights for Uyghur terrorists in Xinjiang. Again, that's how they see it. That's not what I'm saying. That's how they see it. And I don't see that as really changing anytime in the near future. I think that's sort of the nature of these political systems. So that's going to be a factor that will kind of override a lot of other problems.
I continue to think that leadership counts, and given the fact that, roughly translated, make Russia great again, make China great again, or somewhat similar to make the US great again, how do you see the degrees of freedom created by the personalities of the leadership and what happens in the body politic around them that doesn't allow them to back up? What do you see as the driving forces, and is that likely to create a different kind of tension than if we could have something that might well go connect?
Well, I agree with you that leadership is very important, and especially with these two. And in a way, both are trying to, as you said, make their countries great again. Both, I think, are also not doing the best job of it. Okay? I mean, Xi Jinping is putting more emphasis on the state-owned enterprises and on neo-mercantilist mechanisms, like Putin is, rather than undertaking reforms that they really need. And so they're storing up problems, I think, for the long run. But if you try to sort out how much of that from the personality versus larger structural factors, again, hard to say. If somebody were to replace them, I mean, maybe I'm not getting at what you're suggesting, but if someone were to replace them, I'm not sure I would see anything that different.
Or worse?
It could very well be worse. And we were talking about that at lunch with the students. What after Mr. Putin? It could be a real Russian nationalist who, at least Mr. Putin's trying to balance off the different elements of nationalism in Russia, some of which are very ugly, like the ones we see here in this country, only maybe even more so. But that is a likely route for consolidating power when you don't have the institutional mechanisms to back you up. In our country, the institutional mechanisms constrain the worst instincts, at least to a certain extent, of our leaders, whereas they don't in these two. And you could get people who are even worse. Yes?
Yeah, I have a quick question. You used, and it's actually sort of related to Sam's question just prior to Joe. You used I thought it was interesting. You talked about opposition to U.S. unilateralism and how both China and Russia favor like sort of multilateralism, and then later you talked about, let's see how to put the phrasing, the strategic, comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination. So I thought those two terms were so interesting because it almost sort of sounds like they're, dedicated to these like multilateral kind of cooperative relationships. And I'm just wondering if, I don't know, I mean, is it really just sort of that in reaction to, U.S. unilateralism and trying to oppose that? Or, do both really have sort of like regional aspirations and they're just sort of coordinating purely for like economic reasons? Or do you see a real strategic partnership in some way, in that there are these sort of, I mean, you mentioned that they're obviously not willing to sign into, any kind of like true mutual defense kind of agreements, but I don't know, is there a real sense of kind of institutional cooperation in some way, or? It's kind of a vague question.
I'd take your question, which is a really good one, and just shift it a little bit and say, like myself, they're realists.
Yeah.
Okay, in the IR sense of the term, which means, oh, we're weaker than the U.S. How can we constrain U.S. power? Through the UN. We have Security Council vetoes. So, international law becomes very important. Does it mean they're committed to international law? No. It means you use it to constrain what the U.S. can do.
So it's really just the balancing.
And then and just like, well, we do that too. And that was Stephen Krasner's book, right?
Yeah.
Hypocrisy, Sovereignty as Hypocrisy. That's what great powers do. So this is a way to constrain the U.S. by saying, oh, the U.S. is not following what the UN wants. And that was the thing again about 1999 in Kosovo, was that we went outside the UN Security Council. We couldn't get a vote for acting against the Serbs. And on top of that, we bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. So clearly these Americans are outside of the operation of international law. What about Crimea? Well, that was historically the right thing to do. Wasn't it a violation of international law? Well, yes, but it was historically the right thing to do. Same thing with the 9-dash line and the islands and so forth. So that's how they see it. Again, if 50 years from now, China with Russia as a younger brother is definitely on top of the world, then they may be far more committed to the reality of international institutions than now. But right now, it's a great way to constrain U.S. power.
So at lunch you talked a little bit about like potential areas of cooperation between the U.S. and Russia that haven't really been capitalized on, like counter-narcotics, stuff like that, that we haven't really been successful in cooperating on. Do you see any overlapping areas of interest between Russia, China, and the U.S. and between these three powers that could possibly lead to cooperation?
The Korean Peninsula could be one. All three countries agree that it would be really helpful if Kim Jong-un would give up his nuclear weapon, right? So they can agree on that. But then again, it's always, once you get into the weeds, then you say, oh, okay. Our position is support South Korea, denuclearize the peninsula, and ideally it would be unified under one government and be democratic. Chinese or Russian perspective is more, yes, we'd like to see the nuclear weapons out of there. We don't mind so much if it's unified, but we don't want it to be a hard landing where you have refugees flowing over. Certainly China doesn't want a slew of refugees flooding into their territory. They certainly don't want a strong unified Korea with American forces and American weapons still there. They don't want that. So given those factors, the status quo with the nuclear weapons is better than what might happen, which would probably be worse. So there's an example where we could cooperate, but again, when you get into the specifics, it's always more complicated. And then terrorism, okay, but then Chinese argue that they're dealing with terrorism in Xinjiang, and the US argues that you're unjustly imprisoning tens of thousands of Uyghurs who haven't done anything more than practice their religion. So we just, again, we see the world very differently. That makes it hard to cooperate in areas where otherwise we should be able to cooperate. Yeah, you.
My question is a little similar to that, but are there any instances where like U.S. and Russian relations or interests threaten the relations between Russia and China, or like vice versa with U.S.-Chinese relations or partnerships threatening the relationship, or is it just U.S. and Russia versus China? I mean, U.S. versus Russia and China.
Well, that's a very good question. Offhand, I don't see anything along that dimension.
Well, one area where they could be bumping up, but it's not so much US and Russia coordinating, is India. India presents an interesting opportunity for us, as you mentioned, our
Yeah.
trade there. Russia has a long-standing interest that we could be bumping up against each other. And then, of course, as both parties are warming with India, China has its long-standing antagonism. Although that antagonism is somewhat tempered by their very strong trading relationships. So it's very complicated. But India is kind of an interesting dynamic between all three.
Yeah, something to keep in mind with India, though, is the Indians are so damn independent-minded that no matter what Russia or China or the U.S. does, India